I've always been sympathetic to Thomas in this story. I identified with his doubt. I didn't see that doubt as exhibiting a lack of faith, but rather a way to make faith stronger. Make it stronger by squarely facing whatever questions come up, whatever doubts you may have. When I was young, in high school and college, and then in seminary, and really throughout my ordained ministry, I've promised myself that I wouldn't affirm what I didn't believe. Now, that didn't make me just throw things out. My commitment to the church, to the Christian tradition, made me also decide not to dismiss these things out of hand. But if something seemed unbelievable, I would hold it and look at it, revisit whatever it was from time to time to see if there were a different understanding I could have, or a different interpretation I could make, a different perspective that might be available that would make more sense than what was seeming incredible. And that's worked for me pretty well. It's allowed me to go deeper in faith than I would have if I had simply either accepted or rejected whatever questionable, doubt-provoking statements were being made. The story about Thomas, presented in the Gospel according to John, reflects one of the early divisions within the Christian community that can be characterized as Orthodox versus Gnostics, John versus Thomas. The Orthodox side, the John side, is calling for acceptance of the teachings of the church without necessarily any direct experience of what's being taught. Do not doubt, but believe. The passage has Jesus say, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." I think the Orthodox side depended on that because they had come to realize that the community of Christians was going to way outlast the first apostolic generation. They had to pass on what they gained from their direct experience to people who didn't have that direct experience. Now, the Gnostics, the Thomas side, on the other hand, tried to find ways to replicate, I think, direct experience. They passed on teachings that were meant to transform the initiate by those teachings in certain ways that brought about a kind of enlightenment experience that developed a saving knowledge. Now, what I've realized this time around, and every time you read these things, you learn something new, or get given something new. It seems to me that both sides are arguing over stereotyped versions of their opponents. They're setting up straw men, it's called, and knocking those over and thinking that they're winning the argument. That's an unfortunate, I think, quite common practice. The Orthodox side portrays the knowledge sought by Gnostics as some kind of insistence on physical proof, sticking your fingers into the hands, the wounds in Jesus' hands, putting your hand into his side. that wasn't really what they were saying. The knowledge that Gnostics really were trying to achieve, a kind of spiritual wisdom, really was a new way of seeing things, a way of seeing through things. And it was part of a wisdom tradition that was a big part of both Greek and Jewish religious culture, and had been for a long time. For their part, the Gnostics stereotyped the Orthodox as being rigidly literalistic and moralistic and authoritarian, treating belief like a Pharisaic rule or regulation. But what the Orthodox were really calling for, I think, was to understand faith as relationship. Relationship with God, relationship with the world, relationship with each other. It was more like love than knowledge. Faith came through community. When the disciples were together, Thomas wasn't with them when Jesus first came. They were together. When Thomas joined them, he could have the experience. The book of Acts talks about the communal support and community of the early church. Whereas with the Gnostics, it was more of an individual thing than a communal thing. Also notice that both stereotypes portray their opponents as taking a very materialistic position. And both sides felt that a materialistic position stood against what they had experienced as a deeper spiritual reality. Demanding either physical proof or simply blind faith really kept the believer on the surface of things, which is something that we need to avoid as well, no matter which side of this debate, Gnostic or Orthodox, John or Thomas, that we may favor. So much of what I've preached over the years about and taught about during my ministry has had to do with pointing out the reality of spiritual experience, the reality of a spiritual dimension as real as matter. Something that can't be tied down to objective description or logical explanation, but nevertheless is at the center of things. And it seemed to me that Western thought, for the last 500 years, maybe 400 years, technological culture simply ignored that spiritual side of life because it couldn't have control over it, maybe. It was dominated by the more verbal, more rational, more linear and calculative kind of left side of the brain sort of thinking that dominates. But I really felt that the imaginative, relational, musical, right brain experience needed to be accessed and exercised in order to have a full life. A life that was open to depths and the deeper truths of religious tradition. I think that religious practice that remains dominated by words and logic does become legalistic, does become puritanical, does become oppressive in the ways that it alienates people from one another. Because when you're objective, everything's an object. And that's taken over enough that so many people, just in the last 50 years that I've been ordained, have rejected religion altogether. Doesn't seem appealing. But now, I find that I have to correct that criticism somewhat. Because after the experience of the last few years, especially the experience of the last 6 months of the extremism and anger that's taken over parts of our culture to the point where we can't even agree what reality is. We can't even agree what the truth is anymore. Total reliance on objectivity, on rationality, can certainly be a block to spiritual experience. But when logic and objective thinking are fully abandoned in service of some self-aggrandizing fantasy based only on gut feelings or alternative facts, what results is not a more spiritual religious attitude, but a kind of dangerously ignorant fanaticism. Letting go of the demand to keep an objective distance helps us to overcome our sense of separation from the world, separation from each other, separation from God, but rejection of any rational checks on what we tell people we believe erases the integrity of individual thought and just leaves us with a mob mentality that's highly susceptible to emotional manipulation. We need what could be called a Goldilocks faith, a Goldilocks theology, a Goldilocks morality, a kind of middle way that's not too cold, too objectively tied to verbal descriptions, but also not too hot, flailing about in the subjectivity of a passionate primal scream. Now, Anglicanism, the Episcopal Church, has been very good for a long time at finding a middle way and coping with these polarities. I think in this case, the middle way can't be a kind of deflating compromise where you give up what you really care about and just kind of have a mediocre agreement. But it can be a middle way that's also transcendent, a kind of dialectic where these two views being put together raises our thought and our experience and our emotion in ways that can't be done on that single kind of media-dominated plane. And I think that midpoint, that middle, that transcendent middle is something we haven't thought of yet. Something we need to hold in our hands and look at and examine and see what might come. And we can only find it if we start dropping the stereotypes that we put on our opponents and find new perspectives, new possibilities, as well as places that we might actually agree. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. Peace be with you. Thanks be to God.